I had visited my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, one day in the autumn of last year, and discovered him in deep conversation with a very stout, florid-faced, elderly gentleman with fiery red hair. After apologizing for my intrusion, I was about to leave when Holmes abruptly pulled me into the room and closed the door behind me. Holmes cordially informed me that I could not have arrived at a better time. I expressed my concern that he might be engaged, to which he replied that he was indeed very much so. I then offered to wait in the next room, but Holmes insisted that it was unnecessary. He introduced the gentleman as Mr. Wilson, his partner and helper in many successful cases, and assured me that he would be of great use in this case as well. The stout gentleman rose halfway from his chair to greet me with a quick, questioning glance from his small, fat, encircled eyes. Holmes suggested I try the settee, then settled into his armchair, bringing his fingertips together as he often did when in a judicial mood. He expressed his knowledge of my love for the bizarre and the unconventional, noting my enthusiasm in chronicling and sometimes embellishing his adventures. I acknowledged that his cases had been of great interest to me. Holmes reminded me of a recent remark he made just before addressing a simple problem presented by Miss Mary Sutherland about the strange effects and extraordinary combinations found in life itself, which often surpass the imagination. I had previously doubted this proposition, but Holmes was determined to convince me by piling fact upon fact until I conceded his point. He explained that Mr. Jabez Wilson had called upon him that morning to share a narrative promising to be among the most singular he had ever heard. Holmes recalled that the strangest and most unique things often relate not to larger crimes but to smaller ones, and sometimes there is doubt whether a crime has been committed at all. He asked Mr. Wilson to recommence his narrative, not only because I had not heard the start, but also because the peculiar nature of the story warranted every possible detail from his lips. Typically, a slight indication of events would guide Holmes by recalling similar cases, but in this instance he found the facts unique to the best of his knowledge. The portly client puffed out his chest with pride and pulled a dirty and wrinkled newspaper from his greatcoat. As he perused the advertisement column, I observed him closely, attempting to discern clues from his dress or appearance, following the example of my companion. However, I gleaned little from my inspection. Our visitor appeared to be an average, commonplace British tradesman, obese, pompous, and slow. He wore baggy gray shepherd's check trousers, a not overly clean black frock coat, unbuttoned in the front, a drab waistcoat with a brassy Albert chain, and a square pierced metal ornament. A frayed top hat and a faded brown overcoat with a wrinkled velvet collar lay on a chair beside him. Despite a close look, nothing remarkable seemed evident about the man except his blazing red head, and a look of extreme chagrin and discontent on his features. Holmes quickly assessed my scrutiny with a smile, shaking his head. He noted that beyond the evident facts of Mr. Wilson's manual labor, snuff-taking, Freemasonry, time spent in China, and recent extensive writing, he could deduce nothing else. Mr. Jabez Wilson started in his chair, questioning how Holmes knew all that, particularly his manual labor, which he confirmed as true, having begun as a ship's carpenter. Holmes pointed out his right-hand size, larger than the left, due to developed muscles from work. Mr. Wilson inquired about the snuff and Freemasonry, to which Holmes refrained from explaining, especially since Mr. Wilson wore an arc and compass breastpin against the order's strict rule. Mr. Wilson had forgotten about that detail, but was curious about the writing deduction. Holmes explained it was the shiny right cuff and the smooth patch on the left indicating desk work. Mr. Wilson was further intrigued by the knowledge of China. Holmes noted the fish tattoo above Mr. Wilson's right wrist, a style peculiar to China, and the Chinese coin on his watch chain, making the deduction simple. Mr. Wilson laughed, initially impressed, but then realizing the deductions were straightforward. Holmes expressed concern that his candid explanations might harm his reputation, as explained by the saying omni ignitum pro magnifico. He asked Mr. Wilson if he had found the advertisement, to which Mr. Wilson confirmed, pointing it out with his thick red finger. I read the advertisement aloud, which called for red-headed men to apply for a vacancy in the Red-Headed League, offering a salary for nominal services. Holmes chuckled, noting the advertisement's unusual nature, and encouraged Mr. Wilson to share details about himself, his household, and the advertisement's impact on his fortunes. I noted the paper and date. The Morning Chronicle of April 27, 1890, just 2 months prior. Mr. Wilson recounted his story, mentioning his small pawnbroker's business at Coburg Square, which barely provided a living. He once employed 2 assistants, but now only 1. Vincent Spaulding, who worked for half wages to learn the business. Holmes inquired about Spaulding, and Mr. Wilson described him as smart and capable, but with a penchant for photography, often diving into the cellar to develop pictures. Despite this, he was a good worker. Mr. Wilson confirmed Spaulding was still with him, alongside a 14-year-old girl who did simple cooking and cleaning. They lived quietly, managing to keep a roof over their heads and pay debts. The advertisement had caught Spaulding's attention, leading him to express a wish to be red-headed. Mr. Wilson inquired why, and Spaulding explained the League of the Red-Headed Men had a lucrative vacancy. Spaulding showed Mr. Wilson the advertisement, explaining the League was founded by an American millionaire, Ezekiah Hopkins, who had left his fortune to support red-headed men. Despite Mr. Wilson's skepticism about the competition, Spaulding encouraged him to apply. Mr. Wilson's rich red hair gave him confidence, and Spaulding's knowledge seemed useful, so they closed the business and headed to the advertised address. Mr. Wilson described the astonishing sight of Fleet Street crowded with red-headed men of all shades. Despite the crowd, Spaulding managed to push Mr. Wilson through to the office. The office contained only a couple of chairs and a deal table, with a small red-headed man behind it. He found fault with each candidate, but was favorable to Mr. Wilson, closing the door for a private conversation. Spaulding introduced Mr. Wilson, and the man, Mr. Duncan Ross, admired Mr. Wilson's hair and congratulated him on his success. Mr. Ross tugged on Mr. Wilson's hair to ensure it was genuine, then announced vacancy filled. He expressed concern about Mr. Wilson being unmarried, as the fund aimed to propagate red heads, but decided to make an exception. Mr. Wilson agreed to the hours and duties, copying the Encyclopaedia Britannica from 10 to 2, with no allowance for leaving the office during those hours. Mr. Wilson returned home, initially pleased, but grew skeptical, thinking the offer too good to be true. Spaulding reassured him, and Mr. Wilson decided to try it out. The arrangement went smoothly, with Mr. Ross occasionally checking in, and Mr. Wilson received 4 sovereigns weekly. This continued for 8 weeks until one morning the office was closed with a sign announcing the dissolution of the Red-Headed League. Holmes and I found the situation amusing, though Mr. Wilson was not amused by our laughter. Holmes assured him he would not miss the case for the world, and asked about Mr. Wilson's steps after finding the card. Mr. Wilson visited nearby offices, and the landlord, who had no knowledge of the League or Mr. Duncan Ross, who was actually William Morris, a solicitor temporarily using the office. Mr. Wilson sought Holmes's advice after Spaulding suggested waiting for a letter, which was unsatisfactory for Mr. Wilson. Holmes declared the case remarkable and agreed to investigate, suggesting graver issues might be involved. Mr. Wilson expressed concern about losing the income, but was reassured by Holmes's observation that he gained knowledge and money. Mr. Wilson wanted to uncover the true nature of the League. Holmes questioned Mr. Wilson about Spaulding. Learning he had been employed for about a month came cheaply and had pierced ears. Holmes was intrigued by these details, considering them significant. After Mr. Wilson left, Holmes asked for my thoughts, but I found the case mysterious. Holmes noted that bizarre cases often proved less mysterious than they seemed, and decided he needed to think. He requested silence while he smoked, a process he likened to solving a problem. After some time, Holmes sprang up with a plan, inviting me to accompany him to a concert, noting his preference for the introspection offered by German music over Italian or French.